more lies and forgery and lying and deception. So, is that what lies behind the lockdown? It says, the Mail on Sunday says that Boris Johnson's astonishing bid to nail Leaker, who bounced him into lockdown. So it's all lies again, isn't it? And Peter Hitchens says on page 31, he will never forgive the clowns who cancelled Remembrance Sunday. These are all kind of shadowboxing. And on page 24, it says the children are 22 months behind on writing. Operation Chattirat Catcher. Glenn Owen reveals the inside story of the hunt to catch the leaker who bounced Boris Johnson into lockdown. They're sending us to hell in a handcart. On the back of a dossier so dodgy, even Blair wouldn't have touched it, says David Mellor. That's a kind of treble-layered lie because David Mellor himself is a liar. And it's astonishing, too, to find Mellor given a spot on the mainstream media, Fleet Street, and especially by the Mail on Sunday, which actually years ago exposed him as a liar and a cheat. And this piece about by Douglas Murray, who says that warning to all those cheering Biden's win, he is no friend of Britain, says Douglas Murray. And David Blunkett is brought back from the world of the political dead, again by the Mail on Sunday, praising Donald Trump. And on pages 14 and 15, the Mail on Sunday says, in a piece from Philadelphia, byline to Ian Birol, that this is a new civil war, and it says the blood-chilling words of a Trump supporter in Joe Biden's home state, where, as Ian Birol reports, friends, families, and even children remain bitterly divided amid growing fears of serious unrest in the United States. And here is a piece by Candace Owens, photographs standing behind a grinning Donald Trump. So a black woman says, why does a young black woman like me back the Donald? He gives a voice to the voiceless, she says. And then there is the piece about Kamala Harris on page 12, which says, Kamala's next goal, the most left-wing president in history. Well, that is a complete lie because Kamala Harris is not left-winger. And here is Piers Morgan, instantly transformed into a fan of the Democratic Party. And there is Caroline Graham. Now, this woman, I suspect she worked for the Newham Recorder in the late 1980s. And she denied that she was the same Caroline that I had contacted to check something that the Newham Recorder published when I was organizing the campaign after the arrest of the 42 plus Bangladeshis in the Bethnal Green Road on the 15th of July 1989. That was a protest organized by some other people after the murders of Ismat Ali and his nephew, Watir Ali, in the Flower and Dean Walk on the 9th of July 1989. And the campaign that I had to organize against the arrest of the 42 Bangladeshis was reported by the Newham Recorder, and this woman who did the reporting turned up, and her name was Caroline something. She changed the name, the second name since then, and she had moved to the Daily Mail group and to America from there on their behalf. Now that was 1989, and there was no internet, not accessible to or known to the ordinary community, including me. So the printed papers were the main platforms and the sources of publishing information that was, looking back now, more substantial and had more impact than these papers now have. The Newham Recorder is still in circulation, but it is a fraction of the paper that it used to be, even in the 1980s. Now, this Mail on Sunday is quick, very quick to start the campaign against the Democrats' president-elect. And the mink COVID has been spreading from America to Italy as mutant virus is found. When Daisy Edgar Jones popped up for grocery supplies at Marks and Spencer's last week, she donned a pair of Jimmy Choo trainers that sell for a cool £350. The 22-year-old is unlikely to have paid that much, though, as earlier this year, she signed up to be the face of the upmarket fashion brand in a series of advertisements, including one for these very shoes. Made from calf leather. Now, this is a cruelty to animals, and it is impossible to read on. And on page 2, a reluctant piece by the Mail on Sunday that actually reports Boris Johnson doing a U-turn to defuse the Marcus Rashford school meals row. Should have been on the front page that Boris Johnson has been found to be unfit because he is being involved in serial kind of U-turns. And these U-turns are caused by the work of others. And this actually also exposes Keir Starmer. Because Starmer didn't start the campaign for these free school meals for the children, children from poor families. It's a 22-year-old footballer, Marcus Rashford. Now, what is the essence of this latest kind of decoy piece by so-called ex-Labour minister David Blunkett? This is a piece that actually supports the Keir Starmer move, and it says at the end, in the last paragraph, that according to Blunkett's, Keir Starmer Labour Party should continue to embrace decency, oppose racism, and set about creating a fairer, more equal society. We need a cohesive, compassionate, and inclusive country. And Labour should see off those who sneer at such things. It is time to turn minorities into part of the majority, celebrating not just the differences and the diversity of the world around us, but the basic human values we have in common. Now, that is extraordinary paragraph. That is absolutely extraordinary. And for that reason, we shall be looking in more detail at this particular piece, byline to David Blunkett in the Daily Mail on Sunday. Before that, we have another look at these are the heavy kind of carriages. This is the Boris graph, which has got an equivalent to the Financial Times says how to spend it extra supplement. And it is similarly corruptly peddling the bourgeois kind of complacence and selfishness as to how to spend your money, the surplus money, that superfluous amount of money that you've got. And the Matt cartoon has a take on the Stop the Count in the USA being transformed into number 10 Downing Street, where they want to stop the count because the COVID data has been found to be wrong and misleading. So that's what he's saying, the Matt cartoonist. And instead of running a story about the fall of Donald Trump, they're reducing this headline into a corner and covering the page with a picture of Joe Biden. There is no substance in the headline, really. And they've got this story dug up about Joe Biden giving or playing a part in giving a visa to the IRA's Jerry Adams when John Major was in situation. And there is a huge double spread. Slow and steady eventually won the race after Sleepy Joe burst into life. And then they say that the picture is the biggest possible picture they could accommodate on 2 pages. giving Trump the biggest kind of space and saying that he's vowing to fight the result in the courts. Now, and there are skeptical pieces about the prospect of the UK government having any amiable relationship with the USA government fronted by Joe Biden. So this is Daily Boris Graph, which is understandably relaying and spreading the message of Boris Johnson. And they're not running anything new, they're not running anything original, and they're not running anything really truthful. None of this coverage in the Sunday Telegraph, Boris Graph, has got any investigative report about the evidence on the ground about either poverty, either the kind of pandemic and the impact at the most certainly there is nothing, absolutely nothing about the lack of accountability by so many councils. In fact, in contrast to the central regime fronted by Boris Johnson, they are celebrating the councils on almost 100% success in contact tracing. And they have got a general headline about London: the better social distancing in London sees fewer hospital admissions. These are headlines, these are not factual reports. And they are saying that virus, the pandemic, the COVID-19 kills 1 in 5 cancer patients across the globe. Analysis reveals. And they are admitting on page 17 that the response to the virus echo Great Plague response. Now, when was the Great Plague? So that was nearly 400 years ago, 355 years ago. And as we have been saying exclusively, that for the 70 years, 7 decades of the NHS has been in place, but the NHS has not been nurtured, made fit for purpose, and the NHS main wasters of the NHS resources, the consultants and other big business contractors, have not been held to account. And the preparation for a health service fit for caring and attending to the needs at the point of needs, that health service has not been created. This is the world exclusive diagnostic report and assertion based on the evidence, and the evidence includes the complete lack of any recognition of that central fact by the Fleet Street media, the mainstream, including the BBC and including the other broadcasting outlets. And the Observer, which is Guardian Observer, but even before it was formally owned by and taken over by the Guardian, it was similar to the Guardian on Sundays. On Sundays, it was treated by most readers of the Guardian as the Sunday version of the Guardian, although that was a long time before the Guardian group bought the Observer, and obviously formalized its reflection in the contents and the role of the Observer. So they are now saying on the Observer, page 11, climate crisis, COVID, race relations, what's top of Biden's intro now? Anyone who says race relations is, of course, using that kind of phrase from a racist standpoint, a standpoint that denies racism exists, let alone it violates so many values and so many laws and so many rights and so many people's lives. So the Observer remains a racist paper, and the list it gives of the intro, the top of the table of Joe Biden, when actually in the Oval Office or actually in charge of the presidency, so-called, it gives the Observer's racism away. So that's the Observer's front page today, Sunday the 8th of November 2020. And they're not running anything factual. And Anthony Burgess is reported as saying in 1992, a year before his death, that don't read Clockwork Orange. It's a foul farrago. Now, Burgess was one of the foulest anti-Muslim celebs or writers or big-name writers, kind of carrying on with the contrived fanaticism of the anti-Site and Rushdie Muslims. That was the phase, that was the period before Bilayar created the terrorists by attacking the people and children and women of Iraq. And so therefore, one of the main heavyweight kind of weapons used by the mainstream media, Fleet Street, was Anthony Burgess, as then probably the most kind of influential English novelist alive at the time, because of the hype and the propaganda and the various connections that he had. And all the things that we said about these confected, false kind of narratives created by the pushers of the agenda against the Middle East and against the Muslims generally, have been vindicated, because none of the, in fact, the American network now, which has been vigorously anti-Donald Trump, the platform is called the Young Turks, has been one of the main ones that has admitted that the numbers of deaths of the Americans caused by Donald Trump's policies on the virus are 100 times worse than the people who were killed in the so-called 9/11. Well, this is a new confession, but even before that, every single week, more Americans kill other Americans every week, on average, that is. Not every week is the same number, obviously. Then the fantasy figures connected with the 9/11. And it was the racist strategy to concoct all these lies about Muslims for political purposes by criminals who appeared in 2015 in the shape of Donald Trump, the biggest criminal, confecter of lies and racist hatred. And he made full use of the latent anti-Muslim hostility harbored by the gullibles in the US electorate, among the US public. And that was not unconnected with the role played previously by Hillary Clinton, whose own anti-Muslim rhetoric, her own anti-Muslim sloganeering and threats, intimidations, were almost as dangerous and irresponsible and as lethal as the lines uttered by Donald Trump, late 2015 to early 2016, before the election. And that's how he rallied the gullibles, and he rallied the latent racist morons. Morons is not my kind of description of them. It was in the 1980s, late 80s or early 90s. Donald Trump, a businessman, boasted that he could do anything with the Republican Party, because he said the Republican Party had the dumbest, most stupidest people in it and supporting it, which has been proven to be the case. So, if they say that they're not going to see the America continue on the racist path because of Joe Biden, that would be very irresponsible omission of the facts. Because as I said in the previous edition today, Joe Biden would not be even a candidate. He was almost on the verge of withdrawing, until in one state, a very serious thing happened to reverse his decision. And that was the significant numbers of black people voting for his nomination as the candidate for the Democratic presidency campaign. And the people, the black people, have been from all backgrounds mobilized in an unprecedented way at this election, and the black people have made the difference. It is the black people's votes and mobilization that has played the leading role. Of course, the votes of the other people, non-black people, have also mattered. Every single vote matters, clearly. Of course, not to Donald Trump, who doesn't like the votes, so he thinks that votes should not be mattering. It's the Supreme Court that he has packed with these people that should make him the winner. So in one particular kind of sweep, Trump has abolished even the fragile idea of democracy through universal adult franchise. He has scrubbed the franchise because the franchise has rejected him, which the franchise is only too entitled to do. That's the whole secret power of the vote, universal adult franchise, that it can reject anybody, any candidate, whatever the reason. And that is paramount. That is absolutely undeniable. So when David Blanket appears as a supporter of opposition to racism and universal values and all the rest of it, does he realize that he has the duty to apologize for the success of the Conservatives. Because he, like Chris Bryant and others, have been betraying the Labour Party's founding aims and the Labour Party's democratic duty to oppose the corruption and the theft and the robbery and the criminality that has been going on since 2010 under various guises of conservatives who are instruments of big business criminals and gangsters that propel the economy in the wrong way all the time. By the wrong way, I here emphatically refer to the perpetration of poverty-causing and poverty-creating measures including the token legislation, pieces of legislation, and the fact that the employees in the UK central government departments, in this case, Department for Deprivation, Want and Poverty Creation, that is DWP, also known as the Department for Work and Pensions. Now, that name was created by Tony Blair. Until then, it was the Department for Social Security, which was absolutely the correct name in view of the job that needed to be done to help people in poverty. So by renaming it as Department for Work and Pensions, no mention of Social Security, Tony Blair showed who he was in power for. He was in power for the few, and he was in power to violate the many. So when David Blanket says that Keir Starmer should continue the policies, whatever the policies are, roughly suggesting the opposite of what Keir Starmer is actually doing, David Blanket has to make it clear that if the Labour Party is to have any electoral kind of chances at the next election, and if it is to be expected to last reasonable length in power, then it has to be seen to be committed to reversing and ending the corruption, the criminality, the deprivation creation, and the mass suicide imposition by the DWP of the Tories. And the name of the department should be restored by including Social Security as part of its name. Because the blame goes to the involuntarily unemployed, involuntarily sacked, when the name says that it's the Department for Work, suggesting, therefore, that people who are made jobless, made to lose their jobs, are at fault, and they should be encouraged, in fact coerced, into doing work for their livelihood and living and pensions. And that is the connection, work and pension. You work and you get a pension. You don't work, you can't work, you are too disabled, too weak, or there are not enough work for you to be employed, then you don't get a pension. Not anything like what you need for a decent living. The role of the councils being kind of astonishingly recognized as being better at checking and testing for the virus is in need of being put in context by evidence. And the evidence is to be found in the records of the behavior of Tower Hamlets Council's benefits denial operation manager called Steve Hill. Now, Steve Hill is one of the kind of racist liars and criminals who has been causing lack of housing rights and housing kind of human rights security to thousands of people in Tower Hamlets. In one email he sent to me more than 10 years ago, this racist liar criminal said that he had to deal with 39,000 claims of housing benefit. Of course, it was a very general kind of statement. He didn't have to deal with even 39 cases. What he was referring to was the, at that time, alleged, as he was alleging, because he didn't give me the full table of the evidence, but he said that 39,000 housing benefit applications or claims were being handled by his department. When he said that, the liar made a contradictory statement. First of all, that he was responsible for each decision, each of the 39,000 decisions, and also that he wasn't, because no individual human being could be dealing with 39,000 detailed applications for housing benefit on an ongoing basis. He couldn't. Too many hours would be needed to deal with even 1% of that number. And those hours are not available in the day. So when the liar said that, not only did he tell two contradictory things and lied, but he also said that he was the one that was responsible for each of the decisions. And if he couldn't correct the wrong decision, the latest wrong decision about the housing benefit application that I was concerned about, if he couldn't, then he didn't understand the repercussions of that failure on his part or that negligence on his part. The repercussions immediately were built in by his lying, that any account, housing benefit account, that is shown to be kind of in arrears has to be followed up by the party or parties that the rent is owed to, taking action against them. So Steve Hill did that on dozens of occasions. At least 100 times he did that during the period, let's say July 1996 up to the end, let's say, of 2010. And all these times he stopped the benefit, housing benefit being paid to the landlord outfit at the time. From July 1996 to end of January 2001, The landlord was the council itself, because the flat about which the housing benefit was being kind of allocated belonged to the council. And then again another flat, because the first one had to be abandoned because of orchestrated criminality created by Mike Tyrrell and others on the estate that is in the Barnsley Street, E1. So Barnsley Street, E1, 5RD, I think is the postcode. It is clear from what happened afterwards, later, that Mike Tyrrell conspired with Keith Brown and Colin Cormack to create total unsettlement at the flat, or for the occupant of the flat at Ashington House in E1 5RD, 28 Barnsley Street, London, E1 5RD, and that 28 was divided into various flats, to the point where a group of Bangladeshi criminals operating in the area at the behest and at the prompting and as part of the conspiracy by Mike Tyrrell and other racists and criminals, that group operated around the Ashington House. The Ashington House is situated not far from the Whitechapel Sainsbury's, and it's off the Collingwood Road, which crosses past the Whitechapel Road or Whitechapel branch of the Sainsbury's. From Cambridge Heath Road into Collingwood Road or Collingwood Street. And in that area near the Collingwood Street, Barnsley Street, operated a gang of criminals numbering about 20. And that gang was operating with the active knowledge of Mike Tyrrell, who was still employed as the Town Hamlets Council's housing disservice manager for the Bethnal Green area. He was one of the managers. And the fact that these criminals were operating became the subject of daily communications to the council, because the criminals were blocking access to the flat because they were standing outside the flat, this gang, and on the corridor. And the criminal who was supposed to be in post to look after the estate that included the Ashington House, called Keith Brown, actively pretended that this was not something he knew. It was happening in front of him. So from the July 1996 through to 97, 98, 99, 2000, and up to the end of January 2001. This was a daily occurrence, which means 5 years were destroyed. The work of 5 years were destroyed by the conspiracy operated by Steve Hill, Mike Tyrrell, and Keith Brown, aided and abetted by Colin Cormack. And Christine Gilbert was in post later, and she ignored the evidence. So what happened in Brick Lane in between July and October 2012 and is described as the Blitzkrieg in Brick Lane or the Blitzkrieg on Brick Lane had been occurring in a different kind of location, at a different kind of location, but as a result of conspiracy by Tower Hamlets Council's full-time paid employees. So what was happening in the E15RD area for 5 years was, in addition to the losses caused by Mike Tyrrell, Keith Brown, Steve Hill, and Colin Cormack, that covered and included the type of losses that the claimant against Southwark Council, in the case AA versus Southwark Council, had been caused by Southwark Council's group of employees conspiring to evict him and steal his vital exclusive data containing his work and his documents and his evidence from his computer kind of systems and dump them. These are the findings of the then Deputy High Court Judge Anthony Thornton, QC, whose ruling was published against Southwark Council on the 14th of October 2014. So nearly 20 years ago, Colin Cormack, as the so-called head of homeless section, was assigned by then Tower Hamlets Council Chief Executive Sylvie Pierce. And instead of finding the home for the homeless, Colin Cormack set about a kind of campaign of racist harassment and denial and abuse of his position that Mike Tyrrell started initially independently of any contact or consultation with Colin Cormack, because Tyrrell started his campaign by falsely accusing the tenant of having targeted him, that is Mike Tyrrell, in the campaign against racist attacks. The campaign having to be formed to defend the family of the boy, youngster or young person called Dilwar, who had been attacked and nearly killed by racists in attacks in the old Bethnal Green Road, London E2 area. So in all of these, there was no sign of any activity in even tokenistically acknowledging the daily complaints about these criminal gangs operations and presence and disturbances and violations and interruptions and damaging behavior. All of this fact collectively was made known to the two Bangladeshi councillors. In addition to the third one for the same ward, at that time the ward had 3 councillors, and it was only the third one that took any kind of action, although it was nowhere near the necessary, let alone sufficient amount of action. So what happened was that this particular councillor was the only one who was not a Bangladeshi, and he was called Ray Marney, Raymond Marney, Marney, and his flat was on the Valence Road itself. where he took various steps to stop the kind of large numbers of appearances by Eastern European prostitutes in the early hours of the day, kind of accosting drivers along the Valence Road. So Ray Marnie actually walked and traveled a few 100 years to the Ashington House in the Barnsley Street off the Collingwood Street. And he found and he saw with his own eyes the large numbers of Bangladeshi criminals that were loitering around the building. He did that more than once. Now, how was it that the Bangladeshi councillors, the two of them, one is the housing kind of denial cabinet minister in John Biggs's cabinet now, Sirajul Islam, and the other Salimullah. How did the two of them fail to understand what was going on and what the violations were? And how did they manage to justify claiming and pocketing the allowances for as long as those 5 years? So when I say that councils cause crime, it's not a theory, it's not a kind of speculation. It is that kind of behavior. Behavior that has not been taken to court. Why? Behavior which is so bad that a fraction of it constitutes crime, serious crime, covering at least 20 separate crimes. What were the police doing? So this brings us, that was happening in the 1990s and early 2001. So that is kind of more than 15 years before Lutfur Rahman was ousted. And almost now, at this date, quarter of a century before Lutfur Rahman was continued to be exonerated or excused from being prosecuted for the crimes that Richard Morey, in his ruling, published on the 23rd of April 2015, said Lutfur Rahman had committed. Because Morey was sitting as the election commissioner and not as a magistrate, his findings could only be referred to the prosecuting authority, to the police and others. He could not, from an election commissioner's remit, initiate any prosecution of Lutfur Rahman. That's the procedural difference. But the fact that I'm making here, the point I'm making here is this: that the fact that Lutfur Rahman has not been prosecuted, despite various protests and various kind of objections to the failure by the police to prosecute him or by the CPS to prosecute him, this is nothing new. In the case of Tower Hamlets, Bara, the police do not, and the police have not prosecuted most criminals for decades. So it's not like in a hypothesis, some kind of guesswork. It's actual evidence, actual physical presence of the criminals on the corridors of the Ashington House in Barnsley Street. That the police knew the criminals occupied the corridors. And the police were there because there was 2 police constables or police persons. One was a female and the other was a male. And they took turn. I think the female was there for longer than the male one. And both of them decided not to initiate proceedings against these criminals. So it wasn't like not happening in front of, it was happening right in front of the people who are victimized by the criminals on the corridors. A white man moved into a flat, what is it, 7? Either 6 or 7, number 6, maybe 7, number 7, flat number 7. Is a white man in his either late kind of 20s or early 30s or mid 30s or maybe late 30s. I cannot say how he got there, but he appeared to think that the Bangladeshi born criminals or the criminals that were born to Bangladeshi parents in London were, quote, kids. Instead of calling them criminals and dangerous, he said they were kids. Until one day, about 25 of them arrived in front of his door and literally forced him out of there, and he fled. And the police never prosecuted any of them. So it's not like didn't happen. This was happening. And he said to various people who saw him afterwards in other parts of Tower Hamlets, East End, and asked him where he was, and he said he left the flat. And he told them how he left the flat. And some of these criminals issued actual threats to tenants in that building on the ground floor. And they said that they would burn them out. Now, why would they do that? And how could that not be criminal? And as proof of what they were intending to do, they assembled about 100 bottles ready to be used as Molotov cocktails, which means that they were planning to throw the lighted bottles at the windows and to burn the residents or tenants out. That was what was happening, and that was what the council was told was happening. Tower Hamlets Council was told that was happening. And Keith Brown knew that was happening. It could only have been a policy which was plotted by Mike Tyrrell, which explains why Tower Hamlets Council never took any action against those criminals. Because they were acting in collusion with or as part of the same agenda that Mike Tyrrell was engaged in carrying out. And what was happening on that over the 5 years was known to other councillors, not just the two councillors, Salimullah and Shirazul Islam, but other councillors from the nearby areas. And none of the councillors even once made a statement. How can that be? So this is the kind of thing that must have been taking place in Rochdale and in other parts of Yorkshire, where gangs of Pakistani sex rapists were operating in mainly targeting white girls whom they raped and they abused and whose lives they destroyed. And that must have been happening for as long as has been claimed in the various reports later. So the council knew, or the local council in each of the area, that this was happening, including some in Greater Manchester. The councillors knew, the council officials knew, and the police knew. So these girls were being sacrificed by the local councils. And the local MPs must have known as well. So when the Telegraph says that the pandemic test and tracing thing is being most efficiently done by local councils, it is completely in denial about the decades of betrayal of the duties to the local communities by the local councils. And it is in denial of the role of these councils in creating homelessness, in creating housing insecurity, and in creating frightening uncertainty in the lives of so many people whose homes are plagued by gangs of criminals engaged in their crimes by the local councils and tolerated in the criminality by the local police. Now add up the numbers of people that have been involuntarily denied housing, involuntarily put on housing waiting list, because it's not families. Half or at least a third of the people on the housing waiting list must be single persons of both main kind of sexual gender orientations and identities. So when they say that families, that is misleading. That leaves out almost half of the people are victimized by the intentional creation of the housing crisis by the councils. If you multiply the cases of these criminals that were operating on the Ashington House, if you multiply by the numbers of, say, similarly kind of located sink estates where the criminals can operate, it would be like at least 20 or 30 sink estates across Tower Hamlets, where the council was pursuing a criminal series of criminal attacks on tenants and residents. And that is the kind of distribution of the various parts played by the perpetrators. The council is tolerating the criminals carrying out the crimes, and the council at another stage engaging them to do the crimes. And the other stage, the council is allocating them to do the crimes. So instead of allocating housing, safety and safe housing, the council was allocating criminals to make safe and safety and housing impossible for hundreds of people at any given time.